Thomas Stocker and Jasmine Neve did the layout for us. We now have the data and numbers. In our next session, we will hear from a high-level perspective what this all means for humans who have to adapt or to move because of climate change. But first, I would like to make a short quiz with you. So please take your Menti, your devices, log in if you haven't already logged yourself in. We have 3 questions, and I would like you to answer these 3 questions shortly. Question 1. I don't know if you can see it. Let me take my iPad. In 2022, more people were newly displaced by, and you can choose one of these 3 possibilities. And we will see the results shortly. Let's see the result. Okay. 52% say due to climate and weather-related hazards. Oh, we're almost 50-50, conflict and violence, and very few people say because of volcanoes and earthquakes. Okay, question 2. The number of people expected to migrate in relation with climate change by 2050 is 1.2 billion people, 100 million people, or 5 billion people. Let's see the results. Thomas Stocker is... So the majority of you says 1.2 billion people. Okay, the next and last question. Most climate-related migration is expected to be across national borders from the global south to the global north, across national borders to neighboring countries, or within national borders. What do you think, or what do you know to be true? And let's see the results. Within national borders. The majority of you thinks that it is within national borders. I'm sure our next guest will happy to take up some of the results of this quiz and weave them in his presentation. We have the honor to welcome Walter Kälin at the Symposium today. And I think it's quite difficult to introduce Walter Kälin properly because he is so many things, and I'm afraid to leave out something very important. He's an expert on international and constitutional law and human rights. He is Professor Emeritus for International and Swiss Constitutional Law at the University of Bern. He served as a representative of the UN Secretary General on the human rights of internally displaced persons. As member of the UN Human Rights Committee, he is also the former envoy of the chairmanship of the Nansen Initiative on disaster-induced cross-border displacement, and he is now the envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, PDD. Walter Kälin, welcome.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome, and congratulations to the questions. You got one right. Okay, we are now looking at the issue climate change and what does it mean for migration, displacement, human mobility. Let's start with some figures and scenarios. Yes, 1.2 billion, that's what the media tell us. And they tell us moderate warming tipped to produce flood of refugees into Europe. If I'm not wrong, in the Alps, we already crossed the 2 degrees. Do we see these floods? That's, by the way, a picture when, during the Syria crisis, people were moved to a newly opened camp. Well, that's the media. So what is the reality? the reality today. Yes, we're talking about large numbers. These are the numbers of people displaced in the context of disasters, both weather and climate related and geophysical during the past 10 years. You see it's fluctuating between 17 million and last year very high, almost 33 million. This year will also be bad. Last year it was mostly climate and weather related, and very, very few volcanoes, etc., geophysical. This year will be a bit different. Earthquakes, Syria, Turkey, Afghanistan, Morocco, but still, I would say 80% will be weather and climate related. Most, and this you got right, of these movements are within countries, internal displacement, the very large majority. We do have instances of people moving across borders to neighboring countries. We don't have, at the global level, good data, but still, that's the dynamics. And also, today, most of these displacements are short-term, but there are cases of protracted displacement. Displacement takes place in different scenarios. The sudden onset disasters. Here a picture, wildfires in Canada. Also slow onset disasters. I took the second picture in the Somali region of Ethiopia. Pastoralists I met who were displaced for the second time during the 2016-17 drought, had lost all animals after the same already had happened 2011-2012. The third picture my wife took on Kiribati, one of the low-lying atoll islands in the Pacific, indicates how different hazards often interact. Of course, sea level rise is already eroding coastlines there, but this happened during a tropical storm with storm floods. So it's a combination, the interaction of sudden and slow onset dynamics that often create situations like this where nobody can live. There were houses there before. And very, very important in terms of figures and numbers, and important for Caritas and many of you working in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel region, the interaction of disaster and conflict. I took that picture in Somalia, in Baidoa. In the foreground, you see the transitional shelters set up by UNHCR and IOM for those who arrived previously, and in the back it's those 2016, 2017 who arrived from Al-Shabaab controlled areas during the drought where no humanitarian assistance could reach them for security reasons. Again, interaction. Where are things happening? Everywhere. The blue dots indicate people displaced in disaster contexts. The size of the dot indicates how many people were affected. If you look at the Pacific region, very small dots, but that's misleading because it's small populations. And if you look at the percentage of populations affected, it's very, very high. Very high figures in Southeast Asia, and that's almost every year like that. These are just 2022 figures, so it changes a little bit, but the hotspots, they remain. And then, of course, South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, again, very high figures. And then, yes, Sub-Saharan Africa, Sahel, Horn of Africa. And there you see, besides the blue dots, also orange dots. Orange means conflict displacement. And that's where it's really overlapping a lot and making it very, very complex in terms of responses. But then another hotspot, the Caribbean and Central American region. But then you also see, also in the developed world, we have displacement. Here it's the US, these were the wildfires. 2022 was not bad in Australia, but the year before it was very, very bad. This year it's very bad in Canada. What can we expect? Well, Professor Stocker and his colleagues tell us that weather extremes will increase, and this means that displacement will increase, and they say that with high confidence, with small island states disproportionately affected high confidence. But you're not giving real numbers, and I think for good reasons. The World Bank tried to figure out what we have to expect in 2050. And that's 26, 27 years from now. And it's not 1.5 billion in 2050. It's 216 million if you're not doing anything. But then the good message, the good news come in. If you look at these bars here, the yellow ones are, that's the figure, and that's the maximum figure of 2016 million when we are not doing anything, when we are doing the same we do now. But if we start to really work on the achievement of the sustainable development goals, the inclusive development, then we can lower the numbers, the dark bluish green. And if you combine that with robust mitigation, then the numbers will come down very, very dramatically. So, we are not doomed. There are things we can do. To understand what we can do, it's good to start to think a little bit about when and how do people move in climate change contexts. Here I'm coming back to what was already presented. What is a disaster? And apply it now to human mobility issues, to displacement. Just look at the house here. What happened? And there was clearly rain and then a landslide. That's a hazard. You don't build a house on a slope like this. Exposure. And the house, you can even see it on that picture, didn't have any solid foundations. Vulnerability. And it's exactly the same for people. People are displaced when they are exposed to a hazard and too vulnerable to withstand its impact. And this leads to displacement. Sometimes people anticipate such a scenario and they decide at the time when they still have choice to migrate internally or across borders. Or they decide to migrate in the aftermath because they say, even though we survived, we don't have a future here. Let's go now. Let's go now to have for our children a better life. And sometimes governments say, in order to avoid such displacement, we have to relocate communities. Again, in anticipation, sometimes it's the only solution for people who cannot go back because the land where they have been living no longer exists. And you will hear later on from a good friend from Fiji about the planned relocations already taking place in Fiji for several villages. This indicates, and it was already mentioned, these disasters and related displacement are not natural. It's just the hazards that are natural. And even they are caused by human activities. Exposure and vulnerability are human factors, and that's why we should not talk about natural disasters. We should talk about disasters. And it also means that it's too easy to say climate change is causing displacement, because it's always multi-causal. Yes, the environmental drivers are there, but there are demographic drivers. Population grows and people have to move to live in areas where their ancestors knew that's not a place to stay. The socio-economic drivers, poverty, marginalization, and then also the political drivers, bad governance, discriminatory policies, etc. It's multi-causal. And that's in a way good news, because it helps us to find entry points for policy, for action. What we can do is we can try to reduce the hazard, and that's climate change mitigation. And we really have not to start now, we should have started, as you said, a long time ago, but we have to do much, much, much more. We can try to reduce exposure. This is about planned relocation, but this is also about opening up pathways for migration. IOM calls it often migration as adaptation or migration as a coping mechanism. And much of the discussions around the Global Compact on Migration, of course, one shouldn't mention this instrument in Switzerland, our government doesn't like it, but still is about creating pathways for people affected by the adverse effects of climate change. And we can try to reduce vulnerability through climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, resilience building. At the platform on disaster displacement, and that's my hat today, we are talking here about a toolbox approach. We need to do all of this at the same time in parallel. Of course, as was mentioned before, yes, in the Global South, it's very much about the exposure and vulnerability. For us, it's mainly the first point, the mitigation. But from a global perspective, all of that is needed. So we need to help people to stay. That's mitigation and adaptation, disaster risk reduction. We need to help people to move out of harm's way. And I think later we will talk about tools that already exist for such pathways. And we need to protect, assist, find solutions for those people who are actually displaced within countries and across borders. But we're facing lots of challenges to implement those policy options. Here just a few. We still have limited data and knowledge. We have good data and knowledge at the surface level, at the global level. But if you go down to the locality where you need to implement action, no, it's not good. We still do not sufficiently invest into greenhouse gas emission reductions. And then for people sitting here, we all know how difficult it is to establish the humanitarian development, disaster risk reduction, climate action nexus, because all of that is needed to achieve what I just presented. And then money. But it's even not so much the money that is lacking. What we see in our work at PDD is the huge difficulties for the most climate vulnerable countries to access the money that would be available. It's extremely bureaucratic, and this has to change too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter Kälin, and also for you the possibility to ask one or maybe two short questions now or later on, if you want to raise your hand. I have a short question. You said that we have not the data available that we should have. What do you mean by that? I mean, we're sure we will talk about it also on the panel later on, but yeah.
As I said, for instance, we don't have reliable data on how many people actually cross borders in such contexts, because much of those movements are either irregular or people, for instance, in areas where they have free movement agreements of persons, as we have in Europe. Let's take Western Africa, the ECOWAS region. Whenever there is drought or flooding, people move across borders, go to the big cities at the Atlantic coast, but they are not counted. Mm-hmm. So how do you want to plan if you don't have that? Another problem, in the Sendai framework, it's very clear one of the obligations of states or the expectations is identify areas at particular risk of displacement and then invest into the disaster risk reduction measures. But even the data on which regions, and I'm not talking about the well-known examples of Tuvalu and Kiribati, I'm talking about a community somewhere in the Sahel, somewhere in the Horn of Africa, somewhere in the Caribbean. How do we identify those areas? And that's the first step before we even can start to act.
I'm sure we will talk more about this on the panel later on. Yep. Thank you for very much for being with us, Walter Kälin, today. Thank you.